Well, you better get hip to Podcast by George, Podcast by George, Podcast by George. He knows what he's fighting for. It's Podcast by George, Podcast by George. Wanna know what we're fighting for?
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back in to another podcast by George. Well, we're going to be talking about serious issues today, not the least of which is the climate emergency afflicting the planet. And we've got a returnee back on podcast by George. Delighted to have him. It's Jonas Magram. And just by way of introduction, Jonas is a member of the Sierra Club. He received a BA from California State University. He co-founded and has run a successful small business. For 27 years, Jonah is serving on the board of directors of Fathering Forum, helping fathers give their best to their children. And his bona fides for me, where I first became aware of him, Jonas has been active in efforts to stop that poisonous Dakota Access Pipeline, including forming the No Bakken Here group and serving on the steering committee of the Bakken Pipeline Resistance Coalition. Jonas Magram, welcome back to a podcast by George.
Thank you, George. We got to update that bio sometime. I have a couple more current things to add.
Okay, feel free to toss them in here anytime you want to, because like I mentioned to folks, you've got the bona fides, not the least of which is your action on DAPL on that Bakken pipeline. Now, and this kind of dovetails nicely or segues to the op-ed piece that I wanted to get to that you recently authored. And it is, Biden got elected, the Democrats, the neo-libs, the majority of Americans, actually. The danger here is that they kind of go to sleep, that they kind of forget exactly what's happening. And Bakken's a classic example. That ain't over. It's not even close to over, Jonas.
True that. We have a court decision that's coming up very soon. Because the pipeline, which is pumping about 22 million barrels a day through just a few miles down the road here in my county and 17 other Iowa counties, it lacks now the federal government decided that it lacked the proper permits, the courts actually. And so there's a lawsuit to shut it down because it did not do this environmental impact study. That was the finding and so the permit was revoked. And now the question is whether the pipeline, they're going to do the study, right? They got $3.5 billion in their pipeline. But the question is, should that pipeline be allowed to continue to pump this horrible product, although that's not on the table, while the permit process is continuing. And of course, we hope that it will be shut down because any financial hardship we can create for Dakota Access could ultimately serve our goal of having them go bankrupt and having this pipeline shut down.
Yeah, and like I say, it segues to our conversation today because short term, we don't need it. We don't want it. Long term, it's going to kill us all with the climate and the environment. And there's no harm going to come to corporations or, the pipeline owners or their shareholders. I mean, this is just something that must be stopped, and good on you for leading the way on this now for years. Well, let's get to this article here quickly because I want to read this, and mostly because I can't say it as well as you wrote it. I mean, this is outstanding. I'm going to read the first couple of paragraphs and then we'll jump off into a discussion. But this reads, our worst fact denial, climate denial. It reads, we need to spend a fortune and it will be the best investment we'll ever make. Jonas writes, in the last several years, America has witnessed a dangerous outbreak of fact denial, often with deadly consequences. But not all fact denial is created equal. He says, first, let's look at the factless rejection of the legitimacy of last November's election, with all facts indicating that there was not widespread voter fraud. Some 40% of Americans chose to embrace the baseless claim that the election was stolen. Not even Attorney General William Barr's investigation, a flaming right-winger, he found no significant voter fraud and could convince those people otherwise. The ultimate result, the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, with 5 people ending up dead, millions of dollars in damage caused, and beyond that, the emboldening of white extremism that, according to the FBI, is likely to result in more violent attacks. It goes on to read, in January of last year, there was the rejection of the fact-based dire warnings that we needed to take swift action to minimize the spread of COVID-19. Well, instead of taking heed, nearly half of us again, following the lead of our then president, rejected the science. The prestigious Brookings Institution, again, not exactly a left-wing group, estimates that as many as 240,000 American lives could have been saved had we acted with urgency. Shockingly, even now, after the virus has killed over 500,000 of our countrymen, many continue to deny that the pandemic even exists. Now, normally I don't read that much, but I mean, man, that is singing my song. That sums it all up. I would add to the list of this fact denial thing in recent history, the Iraq War, this Russia-gating that's been going on, this red baiting of America, the Russian bounty story just here over the past several weeks. But those are topics for another day, because what Jonas says is, as tragic as those examples are, they will pale in comparison to consequences of our rejecting climate science. And that's right, Jonas. Those are kind of short-term things, but long-term, it's not going to make any difference if we don't figure out a way to handle this climate emergency.
Absolutely agree, George. Agree with you, agreeing with me. As tragic as losing, say, an additional 250,000 lives is, absolutely tragic. We're looking at the likelihood, if we don't act quickly on the climate, and I want to review what that looks like in a second. The consequences are, we're talking about losing up to 50% of the species that live on our planet by 2100. We're talking about 1 billion. That's almost an unfathomable figure. 1 billion climate refugees by 2100. Mass starvation due to extended droughts, and trillions and trillions of dollars in financial losses that result from the intensified storms, droughts, fires, etc., etc. So, and if I could, referring back to what our goal must be, in 2018, the International Panel on Climate Change, the UN's panel that was consisted of about 200 of the world's top climate scientists representing almost 100 countries. They warned us that we must, by 2030, reduce our global greenhouse emissions by 50%. Now, just to give you a quick idea of what that looks like, every day, human activity generates 152 million tons of heat-trapping gases into our atmosphere. 152 million tons. And we've been warned, as I said, towards the end of 2018, that by 2020, if we don't cut that greenhouse gas production in half, we will exceed the 1.5 degree centigrade limit that these scientists have set, that it's a limit, a tipping point, they call it, that will result in runaway climate impacts that really are unimaginable, and something that humanity has never faced ever in the history of our civilization. So since 2018, about 2.5 years ago, nothing has been accomplished. And as you know, until a couple months ago, we had even withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord. we were our national leaders were calling climate change a hoax.
Yeah.
So, I voted for Joe Biden. He wasn't my first choice. Bernie was my first choice. Elizabeth was my second choice. But the truth is, and I don't know if you want to talk about this right now, but
Sure.
Biden's action on climate so far has exceeded my expectation and those of others climate activists. So for that, I'm very grateful, and I see possibilities. We've rejoined the Paris Accord. Biden committed us to cutting our emissions in half by 2030. We can talk more about how absolutely critical to the survival of life as we know it. It's absolutely critical if Biden is to have a chance of meeting that target. If we as a nation have a chance, it's absolutely critical that a year from this November, we continue to provide him a House of Representatives and a Senate that will support these initiatives. If we get back into gridlock stage, which could happen if we lose just one senator or, a dozen or so, or maybe 24 House of Representatives to the party of climate denial, we're screwed. We're screwed. We cannot waste even 2 more years in pursuing this IPCC target. And by the way, people will rightfully ask, and well, what about the rest of the nations? What about China? What about India? Unless they get on board, we're still screwed. And that's true. But the U.S. is in a position to lead the charge. And Biden has assumed that mantle, if I'm using that word right. So there is hope. There's hope. It's a long shot that we can meet this target. But the alternative of failing to meet it, of giving up now, 9 years before we have to, or 9 years before the deadline, is absolutely unacceptable to me. And, we can talk about some of the pushback, we can't afford it, all this. If you found out, George, or if any of our listeners found out that their child had a cancer diagnosis, a potentially terminal diagnosis, they wouldn't be saying to themselves, well, how much is it going to cost? They just do whatever it took to get the child that care. And the threat we're facing now with respect to climate change is much, much, much greater. We're not just talking about our kids. We're talking about all life on our planet. So that's just a smokescreen. It's going to cost too much. And all of our grandmothers taught us a stitch in time is worth 9, or a penny, what do you call it? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's the wisdom of the ages. So let's get on with it.
That's well said. That's exactly right. I like your optimism. I also did not have very high expectations for Biden. Was not my first choice, certainly, mostly because of his role in that murderous Iraq war. So he is moving in the right direction. I guess my question would be, Jonas, can we move quickly enough with what needs to be done? Because this is a massive undertaking, as you know. I would call on the progressives within the Democratic Party to try to press their own party, if they can gain control again and keep the ball rolling, like you say, in the next election, to do these things so that the corporate interests don't slow this process down so much that it doesn't get the benefit that we need to have. We're back in those Paris climate peace accords, kind of, but I've heard some people say, Jonas, it has to be bigger and better than that.
I wouldn't argue with those people, George, but there's also the saying, "Well begun is half done." So, as I said, I'm surprised at the aggressiveness of Biden's climate vision and plan. It's just a beginning. We've got to press for more, and as I said earlier, that means electing. A Congress next year that will continue to support this effort. If any of your listeners are concerned about climate change, I would say the number one thing we can do uh, uh, in the next year and a half is to vote climate, not make climate one of many issues, but make it a top issue as it deserves to be, because it is an existential threat to life on our planet. Now, that said, I should have described it this way. Let's begin working right now towards continuing this process, electing people. I don't need to call them Democrats, although they certainly appear to be, electing people that will support aggressive climate action. So we can work now. We can talk about it. We can write letters. We can write op-eds. We can continue to educate the public and inspire the public with the urgency of this. By the way, Science, the journal, which is one of the most respected, 150-year-old scientific magazine, recently announced that it would begin using the phrase climate emergency.
Yes.
Because the science supports that language. You asked one other question, but it just jumped out of my mind. Um, Hopefully it will come back. But that's what we can do now. We've got to continue to elect leaders that will support aggressive climate action. And to do that, let's get going now. Let's not wait till next year. Let's educate the public. All of us have a role to play in that.
Well, your closing paragraph in the article sums it up nicely. It says, won't doing all this cost a fortune? Because you're going to hear a lot of pushback on the cost of this, as Jonas mentioned. The short answer, he says, is yes. Yet, when compared to what it will cost if we fail to get the climate emergency under control, it doubtlessly will be the best investment we ever will make. And I see how people can get confused and scared and worried. We're talking about trillions of dollars here. As I mentioned on my podcast, $1 trillion is a stack of $1,000 bills, which they don't even make anymore. A $100 bill is the largest denomination. It's a stack of $1,000 bills, 67 miles high. That's what $1 trillion is. But the American military gets $1 trillion a year in its annual budget. The Department of Defense and HUD just underwent an audit for the first time a couple of years back, and $21 trillion was missing. The CARES Act, which was a huge transfer of upward wealth in this country to safeguard the interests of corporate America when the pandemic broke out, that was $5 trillion that went through in a couple of weeks. It was just rubber stamped almost. That money is available. We can get it. It's a reallocation thing in some instances, but the money is there. Don't be stopped and don't be scared away by the argument on the cost of this. And Jonas, I just got to thank you for this article. I mean, you summed it up great, and I read a lot of it, so we're running out of time here, but I want to give you a closing comment here, kind of give us some last thoughts here as we wrap up.
Thank you, George, because I remembered the question you asked. That is a great question to end the podcast with. You said, can we do it? Is it possible?
Yeah.
And money aside, and when President Kennedy said we were going to the moon in 10 years, we barely knew how to, exceed the speed of sound in our own atmosphere. And he committed our nation to doing it. He mobilized the best minds, the best scientists to get it licked. He invested the money necessary to underwrite that technological and scientific advancement. And we beat his target of 1970. I remember in July of '69, I remember exactly where I was watching that landing on the moon, which was spectacular. Mm-hmm. So we can do it. When World War II broke out, our entire industry here in America was overnight transformed. Maybe we don't agree with war. That particular one seemed worth fighting, especially because of what the Nazis were doing in what the Nazis were doing in Germany. So we can do this. We can do it. It just means we must have the will and the commitment and the vision. And it's not just about our financial comfort. It's about the survival of life on our planet and our responsibility to care for future generations. So we just need to get our own comfort and egos out of the way and seize this responsibility and to do our part, which is everything to solve this climate crisis.
That's well said. That's a great close, folks. That's Jonas Magram, and he just doesn't talk it; he walks it. He's been to Bakken. I mean, this guy is all world. I mean, he's top grade A in my book. Jonas Magram, thanks for coming on a podcast by George.
Thank you, George. Great to see you again.
Great to have you back. And folks, if you enjoy Jonas, if you like what he has to say, if you understand it, if you get this, get Podcast by George. It's easy to do. Just go to podcastbygeorge.com. You can subscribe on any platform you like. You can get us on YouTube, ring the notification bell, like our videos there. Of course, we're on iTunes. A lot of folks listen to the audio there, and we're always available on Facebook. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.